Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Medieval Monday. So, if you'll remember from last week, we were going over the context for our next primary source, the Philippide. Last week, we covered William of Breton, who was the author, who actually still is the author of the Philippide. We went over his relationship with King Philip II of France. We talked a little bit about his education and how he helped Philip get divorced and how he actually helped raise Philip's bastard son, Pierre Chalet. I think it's Pierre Chalet. Sorry if I got that wrong. Now, this week, we're still kind of going over part of William of Breton's character, but this week, instead of his personal life, we're going to be talking about his job. William of Breton's professional career as the military chaplain to Philip II. So, without further ado, let's hit that theme song.
Presenting your host, Cuddy Vibe.
Alright, thank you for the amazing theme song, Odd But Fair. I hope you enjoy this week's episode of Medieval Monday, where we talk about William of Breton's job, chaplaincy. Now, right off the bat, the first thing that I have to address is that at the end of last week's episode, I kept saying chaplainry. That is not the official word for William of Breton's position. It's a chaplaincy, the office or position of a member of the clergy attached to a private chapel, institution, ship, branch of armed forces, etc. So, yeah, I got the spelling wrong. That will be 50 lashes that I'll pay for after the show. I think it would be obnoxious to do it right now. But, let's see, with all that being said, yeah, let's talk about some of the origins of chaplainry. The tradition and a bunch of kind of Christian military traditions extend back to the 4th century in Rome under the reign of Constantine the Great, who was actually the first declared Christian Roman emperor. Yeah. And so during this time period, another one of these, so we get Constantine the Great, who turns Christian and makes the official empire of the religion, I believe, becomes Christian at that point, which sort of starts our tradition of Christian military traditions. Before this, I don't know if there were any military traditions that were, specific to the Christians, but I know there was a bunch of stuff about pagans. I think war and religion have been pretty, tied together for a long time now. And if you hear some scratching in the background, that's my kitty Riz rearranging her litter. Do you hear that? All right, well, so anyway, back to it. The origins of chaplaincy, sorry. I just can't get chaplainry out of my head, but it's chaplaincy. Okay. The origins of chaplaincy are partially from another Roman legend, where we get Saint Martin of Tours. So, Saint Martin of Tours was a 4th century saint. He was a Roman soldier, apparently, and as the legend goes, Martin, who was a Roman soldier, typically not known for their charitable nature, encountered a beggar one winter. So, Martin cut off his own military cloak. He cut his military cloak in half, and then he gave one half to the beggar. He kept the other half for himself. And later, I guess, he had a vision that beggar was Jesus. So that means that he did something good for God, which is pretty cool. And honestly, this is sort of one of the reasons this is a point of origin is because this half a cloak became a sacred relic, I guess. The Latin for little cloak is capella, which is a word that will eventually evolve to become the word for a full-fledged chaplain. So we get our first kind of initial bout of Christian military history under Constantine the Great, and as far as we're concerned, the origin of the term capella is a Latin term that means little cloak that comes from this legend of Saint Martin. So what were the responsibilities of capella back? Or, well, it wasn't, they didn't really call these people in these positions capellas back then. I believe it was like the sacrabot. That was the word for these kinds of priests in 4th century Rome. But we do have a kind of description of the responsibilities that a military priest might have, and one of them being seeking divine intervention on the behalf of the Romans, which, if this tradition started in the 4th century, didn't go so well by the 5th. For those of you who know Roman history, there was a series of crises that happened at the beginning of the 5th century. This was part of the reason why Rome actually had to leave the island of Britain, or England. Ugh. I'm sorry, I'm not great with the names. And so, yeah, I guess divine intervention wasn't really looking so hot on Rome at that period of time. But nonetheless, this tradition of having priests intertwined with the military is something that continues, beyond Rome. That being said, in Rome, the responsibilities were along the lines of, seeking divine intervention for battle, leading in, prayers for the troops, and just kind of explaining to soldiers why what they're doing is in line with God's vision for what's correct, moral, right, and good. And, in this way, as far as I'm concerned, it kind of reads like a bunch of these early sort of positions in the Roman army were more or less laundering the morality of troops, which we kind of historically know to be very brutal in their raiding and pillaging and enslaving of other cultures and people. So, it's kind of a complicated position, but what's interesting is this idea of pastoral care. So during the period of time where there were priests serving in the Roman military in any way associated with Catholicism, apparently one of the roles that was really kind of not so significant during this period of time was what is referred to as pastoral care, which is defined as a compassionate, holistic support for a person's emotional or spiritual needs. So in this case, a soldier's emotional and spiritual needs weren't really a huge part of chaplaincy when it first started. And a large part of this is because, and this is a really fun fact to me, during this time period, you could only confess one time. So if a soldier confessed before a battle and then didn't die in that battle, and then murdered somebody in that battle, their soul would forever be tainted with a mortal sin, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of Roman soldiers seeking to confess before a whole lot of battles, from what I understand. So it kind of seems like the primary purpose of chaplaincy at the beginning of its inception was more or less to lead in prayer, convince people why what they're doing was right, and sort of justify whatever violence that the Roman military needed justified, which, probably somewhat similar to most religious figures surrounding military action. This is a convenient time to say this channel is a big supporter of nonviolence and not murdering people. So, in as much as any of these military priests justified the slaughtering of people by Roman armies, I don't condone that personally. So, just a fun thing I thought I should add. But yeah, so one of the interesting things about sort of Roman Catholicism and Roman Christianity is, as we established earlier, the empire begins to go through an incredible amount of turmoil come the 5th century. It's in 410 that they end up receding from the British Isles, and this is as a result of a number of wars, a big immigration crisis, I think some famines and some diseases. Especially the western side of the Roman Empire really kind of begins to crumble, at least in its influence, in regards to it being a state that has influence over a number of European territories. The Western Empire really begins to kind of, collapse. And this ends up creating a period of feudal anarchy in most of continental Europe that I think really gets quelled more or less by the forming of the Carolingians. But yeah, it's just a really crazy time period where a number of sort of very developed lines of state authority get incredibly disrupted, and it results in a bunch of independent kingdoms forming in a more sovereign way across the entire continent, as far as we're concerned. But one of the interesting things about the sort of collapse of the Western Roman Empire around 400, and I might be kind of incorrect about, how some of this stuff is labeled, but as the Roman influence sort of begins to lessen across the entire region of Europe, the Christian and Catholic influence actually remains pretty intact. So, that's what happens at least in England as far as I'm concerned, and it appears that this tradition of a sort of, capella, it doesn't really go away, but like I said, there's a sort of limited significance that it has at the, sort of beginning of its conception in Rome because of this rule that you can only confess once. So the next major development we see in chaplaincy actually comes out of Ireland in the 7th century, in like the mid-600s, when a bunch of Irish monks introduce a model for repeatable confessions, which means that soldiers had a lot less anxiety about preparing before going into battle by confessing to their, military priest, and then going to battle where they could murder people and not have to worry about God looking down at them because they could just confess again if they find themselves on their deathbed. So, again, this murder doesn't like the murder and death, violence, and destruction bit, so I have to say, I can't really condone this, right? I guess it's great that they could continue to engage in warfare with no sense of, moral concern about being sent to hell, but I don't love it. Nonetheless, this is obviously a very good practice for the military, and so this tradition of repeatable confession ends up spreading from Ireland to England, and then from England to the continent. So by the 700s in France, you can confess all you want, and this is where we kind of start to see this development, actually by Frankish culture in military chaplaincy, which gets officially instituted in April 742 under the direction of the Carolingian major Carloman. So he actually ends up directing a bunch of Frankish bishops to institute new requirements that have that require the recruitment of priests in the army. Just for some context, the Carolingians are a Frankish dynasty of ruler that ruled at Western and Central Europe during the early medieval ages. The first major ruler was really Charles Martel, who was responsible for repelling the Umayyad Caliphate from Gaul in the mid-700s. Or the early 700s, I think. Probably, I think, like 730s. This really established his reign in the mid-8th centuries, and the Carolingian Empire really officially fell from power in around the late 800s. So it really exists strongly, for about 150 years until Charles III was dethroned. And at this point, there's still a lot of Carolingian influence, but its dissolution ends up creating a little period of medieval chaos and anarchy, which we'll talk about further down the line when we're sort of contextualizing these Christian peace summits that begin forming around that time. So that being said, it's during this early Carolingian rule that Carolingian mayor Carloman ends up establishing what are to be known as the Statutes of the Concilium Germanicum, which obviously rolls right off the tongue. And these statutes denoted that priests as capellani, which you already know is obviously an outgrowth of our capella term, they're mandated that the prefects of every unit in the army have a priest in his company, which leads to a dramatic increase in a capellani throughout the entire, military of France. And there are two main types of chaplaincy that we see at the beginning once this gets, initiated, where there are the chaplains for the troops, which by and large kind of seem to be sourced from the parishes of the regions that the troops hailed from. And then there are the chaplains who are responsible for the pastoral care of the leaders. So with this all in mind, this is sort of the role that William of Breton fills for King Philip II in this instance. As we see kind of throughout the development of this history, William will both be an important influence and motivator for Philip II, right? Because, a big part of this chaplaincy position is advising spiritually this leadership position, what should happen, what God would want, and everything like that. And then the other big thing that William of Breton really serves as here is, the sort of pastoral caregiver to Philip II. In other words, if Philip II is ever doubtful of any of his sort of actions, it's really William of Breton's position in the military here that would see him need to sort of justify whatever Philip did and make it right in the eyes of God as far as Philip's concerned, which is really significant when we're actually talking about this primary source, right? Because as much as William of Breton is really there to somewhat document King Philip, his position as chaplain makes him a huge religious authority in regards to what Philip II would have been thinking about at that day on that battlefield. And so when we go and analyze this larger primary source written by William of Breton, this really is, as we kind of stated in the other video, a great window into what Philip II would have used to rationalize, any of his actions on the day of the Battle of Bouvines. The last thing we really want to touch on here is how significant the notion of religious leadership is becoming in continental Europe at this time. Because obviously, you know, a really significant Christian power ends up developing at Rome towards the end of its, you know, larger continental reign. And these, you know, traditions, these Christian Catholic traditions, end up having way longer impacts than necessarily the Roman Empire itself. And one of the major sort of shifts that we're going to see as we continue to explore the Middle Ages is that it really becomes a period where the church makes greater and greater claims on the type of authority they have the right to exercise due to their relationship with God. So this is also another thing I think that's really significant in understanding William of Breton being a chaplain for Philip II, is that it is, to a certain extent, a historical exertion of power that the Catholic Church is able to claim, right? It's sort of, this institution of chaplainry makes, you know, God, and by association the church, a really influential aspect to the politics and military conflicts of the period. And I think that next week's discussion about Emperor Otto and how he got involved in the Battle of Bouvines is going to really help paint the picture of how both Otto and Philip's fate sort of end up hinging on the type of relationship that they end up having with the papal state during this period of medieval history. So if you're interested in hearing about all that stuff and getting more into Emperor Otto's history, make sure you're here next week for our next installation of Medieval Monday, where we talk about Holy Roman Emperor Otto. I think he was the fourth one. So if you made it through this entire video, thank you so much. You know, Medieval Monday is a favorite series of mine, and I love making it. I love doing this research. I think it's really cool, and hope to see you in the next one. So thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and like and comment. Do all the things, please. Please. It really helps. It really helps the channel.